There are moments when a person tries to answer what they feel and realizes they no longer know. It is not the absence of emotion. It is excess. Sadness, exhaustion, frustration, and fear end up blending together without a clear order. When someone asks how they are, the answer gets stuck, not because of a lack of willingness, but because everything feels too tangled to separate. Billy Graham observed this state with care. For him, saying, "I no longer know what I feel," was not a sign of inner emptiness, but of accumulation. Emotions that were not given space at the right time remain there, layered on top of one another, making any attempt at understanding difficult. And so this confusion emerges, feeling a lot but being unable to name almost anything. This confusion is often misunderstood, even by the person themselves. There is a tendency to think that not knowing what one feels is a sign of insensitivity or detachment, but in most cases, the opposite is true. There is too much feeling happening at the same time. The problem is not lack, it is overload. Instead of a clear emotion, several appear at once without a defined order. A discomfort that cannot be explained, a weight without a name, an irritation that arises for no apparent reason. The person tries to organize this internally, but finds no space. Everything seems to arrive at once, demanding attention at the same time. On the outside, they continue functioning. They talk, work, respond, decide. But internally, there is a constant sense of confusion, as if something were always pending without indicating exactly what it is. This lack of clarity is exhausting because it prevents even knowing what is needed. The hardest part is that this state rarely finds understanding. When someone tries to explain it, it sounds exaggerated. When they try to simplify it, it does not match what is being lived. So the person learns to keep it inside, learns to move forward without understanding, learns to accept confusion as part of the day. Billy Graham noticed that many people lived with this internal tangle in prolonged silence. He understood that when emotions accumulate without recognition, they do not disappear. They simply lose their shape. And when they lose their shape, they become difficult to deal with, difficult to explain, and even harder to feel clearly. This confusion is not a flaw. It is a sign that the inner world is carrying too much. And recognizing this is already an important step, even if it does not yet bring immediate relief. When emotional confusion settles in, the first thing that is lost is language. The person feels, but cannot explain. Simple questions become hard to answer. What is happening? Why does this bother me? The words do not come because none seem able to contain what is there. Everything sounds incomplete or imprecise. This difficulty does not appear suddenly. It is built little by little as emotions are continually postponed. Instead of acknowledging what arises, the person learns to move on. They deal with what is urgent, meet what is expected, and store the rest away. Over time, what was stored loses its contours. It is no longer possible to distinguish where one emotion ends and another begins. There are moments when the person tries to organize themselves internally, but feels that everything slips away. They cannot tell whether they are sad or just tired, whether they are irritated or simply overwhelmed, whether they feel fear or just insecurity. The sensations exist, but they arrive mixed together, demanding constant effort to be understood. This lack of naming also generates frustration, because without naming there is no way to communicate. Without communicating there is no way to be understood, so the person begins to respond with short, generic phrases that do not represent what they feel, but avoid explaining what they cannot organize. Billy Graham understood that this difficulty was not a sign of mental confusion, but of emotional accumulation. For him, when someone cannot say what they feel, it is often because they feel too much at the same time. And excess prevents clarity. Naming emotions requires inner space. When that space is occupied, words find no place. The confusion remains, not because of a lack of effort, but because the inner world has not yet had time to reorganize. This confusion does not usually come from a single event. It forms over time. Emotions that were not recognized when they first appeared remain stored away. Not because the person chose to ignore them, but because there was no space, time, or conditions to deal with them at that moment. So they stay there, waiting, Each situation, lived without processing, leaves a small residue, a contained disappointment, a fear that had to be suppressed, a frustration that could not be expressed. Taken individually, none of this seems significant, but together, these experiences begin to weigh down, not as clear memories, but as a diffuse sense of excess. The problem is not remembering the past all the time. It is carrying emotional effects that were never organized. The person keeps living, but with the impression that something is always accumulating inside. When they try to feel, everything appears at once. There is no separation, there is no order. This accumulation makes contact with one's own emotions exhausting. Instead of clarity, confusion arises. Instead of understanding, blockage appears. The person realizes they feel something, but avoids going deeper, because they know it will not be simple. So they postpone it once again. And the accumulation continues. Billy Graham observed that many people were not disconnected from themselves, but overloaded. He understood that the problem was not the intensity of emotions, but the lack of space to deal with them at the moment they arose. When this repeats for a long time, the inner world loses organization. Thus, the present begins to carry emotional remnants from many different moments, and when someone asks what is being felt now, the answer becomes difficult, not because there is no feeling, but because there are many all together without clear distinction. Billy Graham often perceived this kind of emotional confusion very directly. He did not see people as lost because they did not know what they felt. He saw people carrying too much. For him, when someone said they could not identify their own emotions, it revealed a history of endurance, not of inattention. Billy Graham understood that many people learned to move forward before they learned to feel. At certain moments in life, stopping to recognize emotions was not possible. There were decisions to make, responsibilities to assume, situations to endure. Feeling was left for later, and that later kept accumulating. In this perspective, confusion was not seen as emotional weakness. It was the consequence of a prolonged effort to keep functioning. Unrecognized emotions do not disappear. They remain active, even without a name, influencing behavior, mood, reactions. The person feels, but feels everything at once. Billy Graham observed that when this accumulation reaches a certain point, the inner world loses clarity. Not because the person does not know themselves, but because they never had real time to organize what they felt. The result is a constant state of indefiniteness. Something bothers, something weighs, something is out of place, but it is not clear exactly what. This way of seeing did not seek to correct or to rush, only to recognize that there are emotional stories that were put on hold out of necessity, that there were moments when moving forward was more important than understanding, and that this choice, even when legitimate, takes its toll over time. For him, understanding this already changed something important. The person stopped blaming themselves for not knowing what they felt. They began to realize that this confusion is the result of many things felt without space to be organized. It is not the absence of emotion. It is excess accumulated along a path that demanded continuous endurance. Feeling many things at the same time does not bring clarity. On the contrary, when emotions accumulate without pause, they begin to blend. The person realizes that something affects them, but cannot identify its origin. They do not know if it is exhaustion, disappointment, fear, or simply weariness. Everything seems to happen together, occupying the same inner space. In this state, trying to understand what one feels can become frustrating. The more the person tries to organize, the more they perceive the confusion. There is no dominant emotion to help guide them. There is only a general sense of weight, of constant discomfort, of something that does not resolve easily. This creates the impression of being disconnected from oneself, even when one is not. Emotional excess also makes simple decisions more difficult. Small choices begin to require greater effort. Reactions seem disproportionate. A minimal comment generates irritation. A silence provokes sadness. The person feels, but does not understand why they feel that way. And this lack of understanding further increases the exhaustion. Over time, a tendency emerges to avoid contact with what one feels, not out of indifference, but out of fear of encountering even more confusion. The person learns to move forward on autopilot, postponing the encounter with their own inner world. This allows them to keep functioning, but keeps the accumulation intact. Billy Graham perceived that this state did not indicate emotional fragility. It indicated a crossed limit. Too many emotions, without space, without time, without proper listening, end up cancelling one another out. Instead of clarity, they produce internal noise. And this noise does not point to a path, it only wears one down. Feeling too much when there is no space to feel calmly does not lead closer to understanding. It creates distance, and confusion becomes not only the result, but also a form of defense. The mind avoids going deeper because it knows that at that moment there is no internal structure to organize everything that would surface. In many cases, emotional confusion does not prevent life from moving forward. On the contrary, the person learns to adapt to it. They continue working, taking care of what needs to be done, keeping commitments. This adaptation happens because stopping to understand what one feels seems unviable. There are too many demands, too many expectations, too little space for internal interruptions. This adaptation is not conscious. It forms as a response to the context. When it is not possible to deal with everything that arises inside, the person learns to reduce contact with their own feelings. They do not eliminate emotions, but they lessen their closeness to them. This allows them to function. It allows them to keep going. It allows life to continue moving. Over time, this way of surviving becomes a pattern. The person no longer clearly notices the distance they have created. They only feel that something has become confused. The emotions continue to exist, but they arrive in a less defined way. There is no time to distinguish them. There is no energy to go deeper. The focus becomes keeping the day running. This adjustment carries a subtle cost. Emotional clarity diminishes. Self-understanding becomes more difficult. The person knows what needs to be done, but does not know exactly how they feel about it. Decisions are made, but the inner world does not follow with the same sharpness. This adaptation should not be seen as a failure. It is born of necessity. At some point, it was the only possible way to continue. The problem arises when this mode of functioning persists for too long, even when the context would already allow for more internal care. Emotional confusion then ceases to be only a consequence of accumulation. It becomes part of the way of living, not because the person chose it, but because they learned that feeling with clarity required a space that was never available. And while that space does not appear, continuing to function feels safer than stopping to try to understand everything that was stored. This internal state is also reinforced by the way life happens today. Little space is left to notice what one feels calmly. Demands are constant, responses need to be quick, and the time between one thing and the next is too short for any real pause. The person feels something, but soon has to move on to the next task. In this rhythm, emotions have no priority. What matters is solving, responding, keeping things moving. Feeling is pushed into the background, not by conscious choice but by lack of opportunity. Life demands constant action, and the inner world adjusts to that demand, even when it generates confusion. In addition, there is an implicit pressure to always know how one is doing. Emotional clarity is expected, ready answers, quick explanations. When someone says they do not know what they feel, it sounds strange, inappropriate. So the person learns to simplify, to respond vaguely, to avoid details. The internal confusion continues, but finds no external space to exist. This context reinforces the distancing from one's own feelings. There is no incentive to look carefully. There is an incentive to keep moving forward, and the more one moves on without stopping, the harder it becomes to reconnect with what has accumulated. Billy Graham perceived that many emotional conflicts did not arise only from within, but from the relationship between the inner world and external demands. He understood that when life does not offer time to feel, emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, and when they accumulate, they lose their shape. Thus, emotional confusion becomes understandable, not as a personal failure, but as the result of a way of living that rarely allows pause, reflection, or inner care. The person has not stopped feeling. They have simply learned to keep going without time to understand what they feel. Over time, the person begins to notice a distance between what they live and what they feel. Events continue to happen, but the emotional response seems delayed or confused. There is not complete indifference, but there is also no clarity. It is as if contact with one's own feelings had been reduced to the minimum necessary to keep functioning. This distancing does not happen by choice. It emerges as protection. When emotions arrive all at once without organization, keeping distance feels safer than trying to understand. The person learns to observe their own life from the outside, dealing with what needs to be done, without going too deeply into what it stirs inside. Little by little, this way of living becomes normalized. Confusion becomes the default state. Instead of asking, "What am I feeling?" the person begins to ask only, "What do I need to do now?" This keeps the day moving, but deepens the inner disconnection. This distancing also makes it harder to perceive limits. Emotional exhaustion is confused with lack of motivation. Sadness turns into irritation. Fear shows up as impatience. Because there is no clarity, internal signals blend together and stop guiding. The person feels that something is not right, but does not know where to adjust. Billy Graham understood that this distance did not indicate a lack of sensitivity, but an excess of internal demand. When someone has to endure too much for too long, feeling with clarity becomes secondary. The priority becomes holding on. Thus, distancing from one's own feelings does not resolve the confusion. It only keeps it under control. The person continues living, but with the constant sense that something was left behind. Not out of neglect, but because at some point feeling everything felt unviable. And this habit of distancing continues, even when it begins to demand a higher cost than it seems. At some point, it becomes necessary to slow down the rhythm of the text, not to explain better, nor to conclude something, simply to allow the words to move forward with less pressure. When emotions are confused, excess stimulation does not help. More content does not organize. Sometimes, what helps is less. There are people who have lived for so long trying to understand what they feel that they grow tired even of thinking about it. Confusion becomes a constant background, and any attempt at clarity seems to require too much energy. So the body moves on, the routine continues, and the inner world remains in the background. Perhaps it is possible simply to notice this fatigue, without trying to define it, without looking for an immediate answer, just recognizing that there is a continuous effort happening inside, an effort to keep everything functioning even without fully understanding what is happening internally. Here, there is no invitation to analyze more deeply, nor to organize feelings now. There is only the possibility of reducing the demand for immediate clarity, of accepting that, in certain moments, not knowing what one feels is not a failure. It is the consequence of having felt too much for too long. This pause does not resolve the confusion. It does not separate emotions, it does not bring new names, but it creates a different interval, a moment in which there is no need to explain anything to anyone, not even to oneself. A short but necessary space where the inner world does not need to perform understanding. Sometimes allowing this interval already changes something subtle, not what one feels, but how one deals with the fact of not knowing. And that in itself already reduces some of the pressure that keeps the confusion active all the time. Behind emotional confusion, there is often a barely noticed concern, the fear of feeling with clarity, not because clarity is harmful, but because it can reveal things that are difficult to face. When emotions are mixed together, nothing stands out too much. When they become clear, some of them may demand attention, decisions, or changes that the person is not sure they can face right now. This fear is usually not conscious. It does not appear as a direct thought. It shows up as postponement, as a lack of energy to look more closely, as the sense that this is not the right moment to come into contact with what one feels. In this sense, confusion functions as a protective layer. Feeling with clarity can mean admitting exhaustion, recognizing limits, accepting losses, or noticing long-standing dissatisfaction. All of this requires emotional availability. When that availability does not exist, the mind finds ways to keep distance. Mixing emotions is one of them. That way, nothing becomes too urgent. Billy Graham observed that many people did not avoid feeling out of coldness, but out of caution. He understood that there are moments when the inner world knows it does not have the structure to deal with certain emotional truths, so it prefers to keep everything at a more diffuse, less defined, more bearable level. This fear is not weakness. It is preservation. It arises when a person has already dealt with too much without sufficient support. The problem appears when this mechanism remains active for too long. Confusion protects, but it also prevents understanding. It keeps the person functioning, but distant from themselves. As long as this concern is not recognized, confusion continues to be the safest option. Not because it is comfortable, but because it avoids internal confrontations that feel too big for the present moment. At a certain point, confusion ceases to be merely a consequence of emotional accumulation and begins to serve a function. It protects. When nothing is clearly defined, there is no need to act, no need to decide, no need to face specific feelings that might demand difficult changes. The mixture keeps everything suspended. This protection is not planned. It arises as an adaptation. The mind realizes that organizing emotions requires energy, time, and willingness that are not available. So it keeps everything together. Confusion prevents any one emotion from becoming too dominant. No sadness deepens too much. No dissatisfaction gains enough shape to demand a response. Everything remains manageable. Billy Graham understood this mechanism clearly. He saw that for many people, not knowing exactly what they feel is a way to keep going, a way to move forward without having to deal with inner truths for which there is not yet space. Confusion, in this sense, is not neglect. It is a survival strategy. The cost of this protection is gradual. Over the long term, it reduces connection with one's own feelings. The person remains functional, but distant. Emotions continue to be present, influencing decisions and reactions, but without being recognized. This avoids immediate internal confrontations, but prolongs exhaustion. It is important to note that this protection does not choose to stay. It installs itself when necessary and remains out of habit. Even when life changes, when some pressures ease, confusion may continue. Not out of stubbornness, but because the inner world has learned that this is the safest way to operate. Thus, the person lives between two extremes, feeling too much to have clarity and being too confused to act. And while this fragile balance holds, confusion continues to fulfill its role. Not as a solution, but as a temporary shield that ended up staying too long. After all of this, there is no clear final point. Emotional confusion does not disappear because it has been explained. It continues to exist, even when it becomes better understood. What slowly changes is the way this experience is seen. It stops being treated as a personal failure and begins to be recognized as the consequence of a path lived under pressure, demand, and little inner space. There are people who have lived with this state for so long that they no longer know what it would be like to feel with clarity. Not because they are incapable of it, but because they have grown accustomed to moving forward without stopping to organize what they feel. Confusion becomes the background, something that is always there, influencing decisions, relationships, and reactions, even without being named. Billy Graham often observed these situations without rushing to offer answers. He understood that some human conflicts do not ask for immediate resolution, but for recognition. Recognizing that there was excess, that there was adaptation, that there were moments when feeling everything was not possible. This recognition does not solve everything, but it changes the inner tone. Confusion stops being something to fight against and becomes something to understand. Not as a justification to remain this way forever, but as an honest starting point. Perhaps the most important thing is accepting that it is not always possible to know exactly what one feels. There are phases in which the inner world needs time to reorganize what has been accumulated, and forcing clarity before that time can only increase exhaustion. What remains, then, is not a ready-made answer, but a fairer understanding. That not knowing what one feels does not mean being empty. It means having lived many things without enough space to understand everything at once. And that, in itself, already says a great deal. If you feel that some things inside you have not yet organized themselves, if you notice that understanding what you feel takes time and does not happen in a single moment of awareness, I suggest that you subscribe to the channel, because this space was created exactly for that. Here, reflections do not rush conclusions, do not simplify conflicts, and do not treat emotions as something that needs to be resolved quickly. The videos follow a calmer rhythm, with depth, observing common human experiences that almost never find space to be thought about carefully, inspired by the way Billy Graham viewed the inner lives of people. By subscribing, you gain continuity, reflections that accompany you, help you understand what you are living and respect the timing of each process. And if you wish, the comments are open as a simple space for expression. Sometimes putting something into words is already a sufficient beginning.